Continuing topic 2, paper 9, covering generic derivative products. We now look at paragraph 1.4, and that considers futures spread strategies. Now, a futures spread strategy, as it says, can either be intra-market or inter-market. Intra-market, that is, you buy and sell future in the same market, and obviously intermarket, buy and sell futures in different markets. So if we look at the intra involving two future contracts on the same underlying instrument, and the example we're giving, an investor can buy the March XD1 Hang Seng Index futures at 25,000 and sell the April. So there's the spread from March to April, sell at 25,200, and you are expecting the spread between the two contracts to narrow. It's also known as a calendar spread or a time spread, whereas intermarket spread strategies, two futures contracts, different underlying instruments. Example, an investor can buy S&P 500 and sell Hang Seng Index futures. Now, in general, the intermarket spread strategies are seen as riskier than the intra-market spread strategies. Let's now leave futures and move on to forwards. Now, the features of a forward product, a forward contract, you have two parties agreeing to buy and sell an asset, underlying asset, at agreed price, agreed time in the future. Now, unlike futures, the forwards are traded over the counter. They are not exchange traded, and as such, the terms are customized or tailor-made. They're not standardized. Now, we're going to look at a forward contract with regard to foreign currency. Now, this is also covered in topic 5. So I would almost guarantee there will be a question on forward currency contracts. Let's walk through this example. So we're told an importer requires £1 million, GBP, Great Britain pounds, in 3 months' time to pay for the delivery of goods. What that means is the importer will have to buy £1 million. To hedge against a fall in the value of the Hong Kong dollar, so the other currency is the Hong Kong dollar, and if the Hong Kong dollar falls in value compared to the pound, it's going to be more expensive. So to hedge against a fall in the Hong Kong dollar, the importer can agree now on a rate that he will pay or she will pay to buy pounds in 3 months' time. That's what lies behind a forward contract. You're agreeing at a price now that you will pay sometime in the future. We're told if the 3-month forward rate is 10.5 Hong Kong dollars to the pound, that means to buy £1, we have to pay 10.5 Hong Kong dollars. A 3-month forward contract will guarantee that the importer will pay 10.5 million Hong Kong dollars in 3 months' time to buy the £1 million. As it says, the currency forwards are agreements to buy or sell a quantity of currency for delivery at some time in the future at an exchange rate fixed at the time of the agreement. So that's just summarizing what we've detailed in these 3 points. And by way of a diagram, you can see that today we agree an exchange rate for settlement in 3 months' time. Now, the formula that you must know for paper 9 exam. The forward rate is equal to the spot rate multiplied by 1 plus the interest rate of the numerator currency divided by 1 plus the interest rate of the denominator currency. Now, when I say numerator and denominator, I'm talking about the currency rate as it's expressed. Now, in our case that we were looking at, it was 10.5 Hong Kong dollars over £1. That is the numerator currency, Hong Kong dollars, and the denominator currency, pounds. Let's look at an example. By the way, you must know that formula for the exam, 100%. So the exchange rate example, calculate the forward rate with the following information. So the pound US dollar spot rate 1.35. Now this is where it can be confusing because the format they use in the exam and the notes is when they say pound/US dollar, What they mean is number of US dollars for £1. It is confusing. So 1.35 is 1.35 US dollars to buy £1. So the numerator is dollars and the denominator is pounds. The UK interest rate 3% and the US interest rate a lot lower at 0.75%. So what is the forward rate? Well, we use the formula. The forward is the spot 1.35 multiplied by 1 plus the interest rate of the numerator currency. We know that's US dollars. So it's 1 plus, and we do it in decimal, 1 plus 0.0075 divided by 1 plus the denominator currency, which is the UK pound, 3%, which is 0.03. We crunch the numbers and we get 1.32. Please be prepared to do that calculation or some variation of that calculation in the exam. It's covered in both topic 2 and topic 5, so very high chance it will come up in the exam. Now we're going to look at another type of forward, and that is forward rate agreements, FRAs. Now, FRAs are ways of locking into an interest rate, whether you are borrowing or you are investing, because you're unsure how interest rates are going to go in the future. So you use a forward rate agreement to lock into a rate. The forward rate agreement sits on its own. It is separate from any borrowing or any investing you are doing. Now, the last 2 bullet points on that list under 2.3 are important. A borrower entering into an FRA with a bank, it's usually a bank, is the long party. In other words, you buy an FRA when you're borrowing. Your exposure is to borrowing, so your exposure is to interest rate rising. An investor entering into an FRA, so that's where you're depositing money and your risk is that interest rates will fall, you're the short party. In other words, you sell an FRA when your underlying trade is an investment. You're putting money on deposit. So right at the top, we're told forward contract to borrow, lend money at a specific rate on a set date in the future. That's the concept behind it, but you're not actually, the FRA is not the borrowing or lending. FRAs settle in cash, but no loan is made at the settlement date. A little bit of detail, I wouldn't worry about that. FRAs are described by the length of the contract and the term of the interest rate in the contract. It's the length of the contract that's vital, and that will be examined, and I'm going to explain that in a moment. If rates rise above the contract rate, the long receives a payment at settlement. So if you were borrowing and interest rates go up, you're exposed, you receive a payment, and the short makes the payment. If the specified rate falls below the contract rate, so that's you're exposed where you are investing money, then the short, the person that sold the FRA, receives from the long. Now, slightly confusing, but if you just get that relationship into your mind, that is important. Okay, let's look at an example. A 4x6 FRA at 8% on 1 million notional principal is an agreement to borrow lend at 8% in 4 months' time for 2 months. It's not so much an agreement to borrow lend, it's an agreement to buy or sell an FRA based on borrowing or lending at 8% in 4 months' time for 2 months. Now, that relationship is so important. So that 4x6 says that we, underlying this concept, we will borrow or lend in 4 months' time for a period of 2 months. So the difference between the 4 and the 6 is the period, the active time that the interest rate will be applied. And the 4 is the number of months when the borrowing or lending will kick in. So the diagram shows you that the FRA, the initiation is at time 0. You make an agreement to borrow at time 4 for 2 months. The rate set at 8%. That's the FRA price, if you will. And the settlement of the FRA, the receipt or the payment of money, occurs at time 4, at the beginning of the period that the person is going to start borrowing or lending, depending on whether you're long or short. And T4 to T6 is the time period that the FRA calculation is based upon. So look at the next two bullet points. The amount paid at expiration is calculated by taking, this is very important, taking the difference between the agreed interest cost and the interest cost that would have arisen had the loan started at that time. In other words, what the interest rate turns out to be at time 4. And we're told to note that interest payments are usually at the end of borrowing period. FRAs settle at the start. So when you borrow money, you pay interest, but you pay the interest at the end of the period, not at the beginning, whereas an FRA will settle at the beginning of that borrowing period. So the settlement is based on the interest that would be paid or received, discounted to the time of settlement. Now, just expressing that sounds confusing. So let's look at the formula and look at some numbers. But I would say what you're highly likely to be examined on is what is a 4x6 FRA, and it's just the narration of the explanation. But the forward rate agreement payoff is the notional principal, that's what you're basing it all on, multiplied by the interest rate that exists at the time of expiry of the FRA minus the rate that was in the FRA, in our example was 8%. And you multiply, because interest rates are quoted in terms of years annually, you take the number of days that interest is applied for. So that's from 4 to 6, that'd be 2 months, 60 days, divided by 360. And then you discount that amount of payment back, and that's discounted back at the rate of the expiration. That's the interest rate that exists at time 4 multiplied by the 2 months worth days of 360. I must point out that I've used 360 in that formula, but the Paper 9 manual used 365 as the denominator, so I'd use 365 in the exam, but to be honest, the difference between 360 and 365 will not alter the potential answers. So continuing the example that we introduced earlier, after 4 months, we're told the interest rate's 9%. Now, the FRA price was 8%. The actual interest rate's 9%. It's gone up by 1. So the FRA payoff, 2 steps to calculation. First of all, difference in interest over the 60-day period. Well, the notional principal is 1 million, multiplied by the difference, 1%, but we do it in decimal, 0.09 minus 0.08, multiplied by that 2-month period, 60 over 365. So difference in interest, 1,643.84. So that would be paid by the long to the short. Step 2, discount the payment back 60 days. We take the amount that's been calculated, the 1,643.84, and then we bring it back. We divide it by 1 plus the rate at the expiry of the FRA, 0.09 multiplied by 60 over 365. So it's the lower amount, 1,619.88. So a foreign currency forward and a forward rate agreement under forwards. Now we'll look at features of a swap. Now swaps come up in the exam. We get more than one question on swaps. So we have to go through this in a certain amount of detail. First of all, we'll look at the features, and then we'll look at a hedging example. Swap is where 2 parties agree to exchange income streams derived from a portfolio of assets or liabilities. And as we said earlier in topic 1, the most popular types, interest rate swaps and currency swaps. Interest rate swaps are both of them are highly customized. They're not exchange traded. Interest rate swaps, principals are not swapped at the beginning. Currency swaps, the principals are swapped. Okay, there's a diagram showing you the principles behind a fixed for floating interest rate swap. Company A has a fixed rate loan but will want to swap to a floating rate loan. Company B has a floating rate loan, will want to swap to a fixed rate loan. The interest payments are netted off. That's important to remember. Let's look at an example with regard to interest rate swaps. So the points we make, interest rate swaps can be used by companies to achieve a better rate of borrowing than achieved by borrowing directly. And that's what's going to be borne out by the example we're looking at. Price a company pays for a floating rate borrowing is expressed as a margin above the borrowing rate, a percentage margin above. In most cases, it's a LIBOR, London Interbank Offer Rate, or HIBOR for Hong Kong denominated loans. Better the credit rating, the lower the margin you pay. Okay, the example involves Careful Limited and Ambitious Limited. Now, Careful Limited, we're told, borrowed 100 million Hong Kong dollars at a floating rate of interest and is concerned that interest rates will rise. In other words, they're paying floating, but they'd like to move to fixed, and that will protect them from higher interest rates. It wishes to swap, therefore, floating interest rate payments for fixed rate payments. Details of the loan for 2 years with interest payable quarterly at 0% above the benchmark. In other words, at the benchmark. And the benchmark is 3.62%. Company would had to pay 0.1% above the fixed rate benchmark if they had entered into a fixed rate. And we're going to use that when we make the comparison. Ambitious Limited has borrowed 100 million Hong Kong dollars at a fixed rate, the same amount. They've got a fixed rate of interest, as borrowing at a floating rate was not feasible. They can't get access to it given their credit rating. So it wishes to enter into a swap agreement to achieve a lower cost of borrowing at a floating rate. So Careful has reason to enter into the swap, as does Ambitious. Ambitious limits his loan, again for 2 years, interest payable quarterly at 0.2% above the benchmark. And the fixed benchmark is 4%, so they're paying 4.2%. If they had gone directly into the fixed market, the company would have to pay 0.4% above the floating rate benchmark. Okay, that's the example set up. You're not going to get as complex an example as that in the exam. And in the exam, it's set out in table format, and you can see very quickly what the situation is. Now, the situation in our example, before entering into the swap, so this is just laying it out. Careful pays floating at 3.62 and would have to pay 4.1% fixed. Ambitious pays a benchmark of 4% plus 0.2. It pays 4.2% fixed. If it got floating on its own, it'd have to pay 0.4% above the 3.62% benchmark. It would have to pay 4.02%. Now, what is this swap arrangement? The swap arrangement will be given in the question. What we're doing in this example is just giving it by way of a diagram. So you can see that Careful is paying floating rate 3.62 downwards, and Ambitious is paying fixed 4.2% downwards for the fixed rate loan. The swap agreement is that Careful pays a fixed rate benchmark of 4% Ambitious, and Ambitious pays a floating rate benchmark plus 0.05%, pays 3.67%. So that diagram's really what you need to know for the exam, because they will give you some information, and then by plugging the information they give you into that type of diagram, the information that you see from it should be enough for you to get to the answer. But if we translate that diagram into the end result for both Careful and Ambitious, you can see that with Careful, the floating rate receives 3.67 million. So it receives that from Ambitious. It pays downwards floating rate loan of 3.62 million. So it receives 3.67, pays out 3.62. So the gain is $50,000. Now, with the fixed rate, it is paying to Ambitious in the swap, it pays 4 million. So the net fixed payment under the swap is the 4 million minus the gain. So it's gain 50,000. So its net payment is 3.95. Now, if they had gone into a fixed loan without the swap arrangement, they would have been paying 4.1 million. So they're better off by 150,000. Similarly, with Ambitious, in the swap arrangement, it receives fixed rate of 4 million, pays a fixed rate of 4.2 million. So here it loses 200,000. Now, with the floating rate, it pays 3.67 million. So its net floating payment, well, we can see that it's 3.87, I beg your pardon, it's 3.67 that's paying the floating rate plus another 200,000. That takes us up to 3.87 million. But that is still better off than the floating payment without the swap, which would have been 4.02 million. So again, they are better. Ambitious is better off by 150,000. Now that table showing you the saving of 150,000 in each case is, I think, way beyond what you will be asked to do in the exam. That's just giving you the full picture. But I would be very much aware of the SWOT arrangement diagram. I would be able in the exam to take the information given with regard to an interest rate swap and put it into that diagram. So I'll have my scrap piece of paper, I see the swap question, I put the numbers down in the diagram, and then I answer accordingly. Now, paper 9 does have the habit of giving you 2 or 3 questions, one after the other, on interest rate swap using the same data. So be prepared to see that or those types of questions.